Good morning. We get folks to... Okay, this morning we're in Daniel chapter 6, and we're hopefully going to get through chapter 6 again today. We want to try to do these as quick as possible. Next week we'll be in chapter 7, but chapter 7 will be divided into 2 weeks, and we'll talk about that later. Let's all bow for prayer, please. Father, I'm grateful that you love us and you've done so much for us. I'm thankful for just the time we can be together here and look at your word. Bless us as we look into your word, Father. Help us to understand what you want us to know from this chapter. Please help us, Father, to walk in a way today that will glorify you. In Christ's name, amen. All right, Daniel chapter 6. Let me get this thing going here. I've got it on. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's see. Maybe the battery's bad on this or something. Oh, there it is. It came up. All right. Oh, yeah, just run through those 4 things there. Chapter 1, you remember we opened by having a discussion, of course, about the folks going into captivity, and about Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they're being elevated in the sense of being put on the king's council, and they spent a number of years preparing to do that. Also brought out in that first chapter that I think one of the primary reasons for us to study Daniel, or a reason God gave us Daniel, is to help us identify the first century church. And of course, that's what we're interested about. Chapter 2, you remember the king's forgotten dream, and he called all of his wise men in to tell him what the dream was and to interpret the dream. They couldn't do it. And so he threatened to do what? If you can't do it, you're going to die. Daniel came on the scene, and of course, with God's help, Daniel interpreted the dream and really came to the rescue of all the wise men. In chapter 3, Daniel had talks about a golden statue that was built that was 90 feet tall and about 9 feet wide. And all those that were there, when they heard all the instruments, they were to bow down and worship the idol. And of course, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not do that. And as a result, they were thrown into what? We do not know where Daniel was. Might have been off in some government mission or something like that. But the 3 friends stood strong in their faith and in their reliance on God. And when they were thrown in the fiery furnace, the guys that threw them in died. And they found, and they looked in the furnace, and they noticed not only were the 3 men walking around, but there was another one with them. And of course, the Lord was with them. And they walked out of the furnace and didn't even smell like smoke. That's pretty amazing, isn't it? If we can go to the next one in chapter, hit a couple times there. Chapter 4, yeah, okay, that's all right. In chapter 4, you got the tree and the stump. Remember, that has to do with Nebuchadnezzar's being in authority and his kingdom and how powerful his kingdom was. And everybody came to his kingdom, came to the tree which represented him, and they were nourished and taken care of. And there's a picture of an angel coming down and cutting the tree down, but there was something left around the stump. What was left around the stump? Bands. What was the significance of that? His kingdom would be protected. And of course, we know that he went through a period there of being out with the wild beasts and so forth until he recognized that God was who he was, and he set up kings and took down kings. Chapter 5 was the handwriting on the wall. And, Cyrus also conquers the Babylonians, and things are changing. And what we're doing is, you remember, we studied the image at first. You had the head, which was Nebuchadnezzar, then came the Medo-Persian Empire, and then the Grecian Empire, and then the Roman Empire. We're moving into, thank you. Appreciate it. We're moving now into, of course, the Grecian Empire. Well, not the Grecian, but the Medo-Persian Empire. And I'm pressing the worn out button here and it doesn't work. So, okay. Oh, there we go. Okay. I think it's very important as we go into this study to remember we made one statement about chronology. This book is not written in chronological order all the time. You know, you'll see some things going around. We need to remember that. Daniel wasn't really concerned about chronological order. So let's kind of take a look at some other things here that may be important to us. I do want you to note this, that chapter 6 is written to show the success of Daniel in the reigns of the Medes and the Persians. He was successful, wasn't he? And God had elevated him and lifted him up, and to show us, again, God's control. We'll notice some things about this, about the Medes and the Persians, which you already know, that once a king signed an order, it could not be retracted. Not even the king could retract an order that he signed, right? And so we'll see that and how God works with that. So we have some good things here to look at, and we want to pull on down in here into chapter 6. And as we do, I want you to think about these things that are going to be noticeable in chapter 6. Number one, you're going to notice again the preeminence of Daniel. And he is preeminent in the Babylonian Empire, and he will be in the Medo-Persian Empire. How he is he's lifted up, and his reputation is also known. So when we're in chapter 6 here, that's not the day after chapter 5. There's some time there. Daniel has been lifted up, and he's known. We're also going to know the plot against Daniel. It wasn't against anybody else, but of course the other men in control of things were a little jealous of Daniel because he sat over the head of them, and he was what? A captive, a Jew. But so they go out to plot against him, and the plot is successful, but then it misfires. And I think that's what's important. And we're going to notice again in verses 25 through 28 the prominence of Daniel under Darius the Mede. Now let's look at verses 1 through 3. 1 through 3. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps and over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. What do you think the satraps had a hard time with in this verse?
Being honest.
Well, being honest, yes, but Daniel, he's one of the 3 commissioners that was set up over them, remember? You think they like the idea of a captive or a Jew being over them? No. And so they're going to go after him. Excuse me. It says in verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Reminds you of what other great? Joseph in prison, right? How God was always with him and lifted him up, and he ended up in second in command in, of course, Egypt. But now Daniel's looking at being promoted to be over everything. And that would cause some stir, wouldn't it? And so that's kind of what we got going on here. Darius has heard about, I'm sure, the handwriting on the wall. He's heard about that. There's been a lot of talk about that. And Daniel apparently appeared impressive to the king. I mean, Daniel more than likely showed himself for what he really was, a good servant, a good steward of things, and the king is going to elevate him. Would that have been unusual during this time of history for a captive like that, or for someone else to be elevated in a kingdom? Of course, the reason they would have done that in this time period, they would have pulled maybe they pulled Daniel and others in, is to kind of unite things. It's to kind of pull things together. They didn't have the communication resources that we have today. But anyhow, Daniel is there, and he is elevated. Anybody want to add anything to anything that's said here in these first couple of verses? Verses 1 through 3. We've got the story basically set up, right? Here's where it becomes interesting. and verses 4 through 5, that the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption. In other words, they looked to see if Daniel was doing things honestly or dishonestly, and they found out he was what? What does that say about Daniel? I want us to really think about this. Is Daniel where he wants to be? No, he's not where he wants to be. He'd like to be back where he came from, correct? Is Daniel necessarily doing the work that he wants to do? No, God has put him in that position. And here's the amazing thing. In that position, he excelled above who? Everyone else. In other words, he did what was required of him, whether he liked it or not in that circumstance. Now, we're going to learn this, that Daniel would not violate God's will, even in the position that he was in. He didn't, well, we'll look at that when we go down through the edict. Daniel stood strong in his relationship with God and stood strong in the fact that he would not allow these pagan kings to come in between him and his God. And I think that's important for us to remember today. So they could find no ground against him. Have you ever seen somebody at work or in your daily life trying to pull somebody down and they're looking for every reason in the world to do it, and they can't do it? And what they did with Daniel is they used what they knew about him against him. Now remember, Daniel does not do anything in secret, apparently. He doesn't pray in secret. He doesn't talk about his God in secret. They know who Daniel serves, and that's what's interesting about this text. Anybody else want to add in here? Let's go ahead.
I just find it interesting that when I read that, I first thought of the Pharisees in Christ, how, all of a sudden people in power started to plan how to...
Yeah. Get rid of Christ. Yeah.
It's power corrupts us.
Yes. Okay. All right, let's look at verse 4 again. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against, let me get up here where I can see it a little better, against Daniel in regard to government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. So Daniel was faithful to the king, correct? No corruption could be found in him, none whatsoever. And so that leaves them in a predicament because they'd like to be able to have something to go to the king about and say, this fella isn't serving you properly. He needs to be what? Taken down a notch. And they couldn't do that. Look at verse 5. I think we already know. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless they knew this much about Daniel. It goes on to say, unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. Apparently, people knew how strong Daniel stood in the law of God. That's what it reads here to me. And they said, the only way we're going to get him is to do something that causes him to violate his God's what? Law. So they thought they had it all figured out. Because when the king in those days told you to do something, you did it or you what? You died. And of course, we're going to find out here in this chapter that these fellows were probably pretty happy for a while, but they weren't at the end. And so it's a good lesson for us to learn. So they knew who he was. They knew the God that he served. They knew that he prayed. They knew that he wouldn't budge on some things. So verse 6 says, let's see where we're at here. You want to hit me the next slide, please? It doesn't matter. You got the handouts. Okay. There is another click on that, apparently. I do that sometimes. Thank you. Look at this as we go on here in verses 6 through 9. We look at the trap here. It's being set to manipulate the king, and they really do a good job of it. So they're going to get ready to attack, again, Daniel's loyalty to God, to the Most High God, and apparently his worshipful life was noticed by all. So kind of keep that in mind. Now here we go, verses 6 through 9. Then these commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. In other words, they met together and they agreed that they were all going to tell the same, we're going to support one another in this. King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials, and the governors have consulted together. Now, does this happen overnight? No, this would take some time, wouldn't it? And so we don't know the time period. And it's not important for us to know the time period, or God would have put it in here. So they've come together and they've said, and to consult together that the king should establish a statute and enforce the injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. So they came to Darius and they said, listen, let's kind of, I think they were striking his ego, right? Let's make it so that anybody that prays in the next 30 days has to pray through you. In other words, take all the priests that are serving these false gods, put them aside, and Darius becomes the people's what? Priest, okay? Now, some interesting things you might think about here. Why would Darius even think about this? And kind of think that, well, maybe he's thinking this would unite the kingdom better. This would pull together my authority over all a little better. So there might be a lot of reasons he did this other than just ego. All right, so let's go on and read. So, now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Not even the king could do what? Do you remember a story in the Bible about a king who was encouraged by a certain guy to kill all the Jews on a certain day? And so he signed that order. And then a woman interferes. Always a woman interfering, right? You remember that? Aren't you glad she interfered? Anyhow, so she interferes. The king can't change that order. And he ends up writing another order that the Jews could take up what? Arms against the Medes and the Persians. This is during the time of Daniel, you know, and I'm talking about what lady? Huh? Esther. All right? And in chapter 1 and verse 8, and in chapter 8 and verse 8, in Esther, it just simply says that the law of the Medes and the Persians cannot be changed. So Xerxes, or however you want to pronounce who the king was there, Artaxerxes, he just simply wrote another order, you can defend yourselves. And of course that saved the Jews, didn't it? Because they were going to annihilate the Jews, and Haman was looking forward to it, right? Matter of fact, Haman was even looking forward to hanging Mordecai on a gallows that was how tall?
75 feet.
Yeah, that's pretty high, isn't it? That's a lot of steps up to your hanging. And what I love about the story, of course, Mordecai wasn't hung, but Haman was. So God rules. And we're going to see that God rules in this chapter. So it's very important that we understand these things, and we really appreciate them. And several times in this chapter, you'll see another couple of times that the law of the Medes and the Persians could not be changed. So they would have to do something else. Anybody want to add anything in on this? Yes, I'm sorry. Randy, I am sorry.
Rodney.
I apologize to you. Rodney.
I'm just thinking about, you asked a question there, why would Darius do this? It makes me think about the things that goes on even in our politics today. People do things, our leaders, our national leaders, do things just for the purpose of politics. And it doesn't, common sense doesn't even enter into it. Some of
Right.
the things that we're trying to, when I say we, I'm talking about as a country, not that I back that,
All right.
but if some of the things that we're even thinking about today, it blows my mind, and that's only because of politics. Then it makes me think about the New Testament, where it talks about, a lot of the Jewish leaders, when they saw the miracles of Jesus and things like that, John chapter 11, and then they, even at that, they refused to believe in the miracles. They decided in their minds, this is what we need to do so that we won't get thrown out of the temple or whatever. It just, we need to understand that oftentimes people do things that make no sense. When it comes, you know what I'm saying, when you compare that to what the Bible teaches. And so we just need to be made aware of that.
Right.
And so I think the reason Darius probably did this had to do with, you know, the pressure that was put on him about, you know, with this, you know.
Right. You're in control.
Yeah.
I think the greatest thing about these lessons, if I can add on to that, Rodney, is the idea that as God took care of the Jews then, he'll take care of who today? The church, correct? And so God's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So you're right. People just aren't going to sit up and listen to him, are they? And but just a few. Anybody else? John.
First of all, kudos to the guys for coming up with a plan to get at Daniel, who had no weakness, so they attacked him at his strength.
Yes.
That's absolutely brilliant, at least right up until the end of the story.
Yes, until the end.
That is absolutely brilliant, very, very clever of them. One of the things that the early church faced too with the Romans and, you know, at various other times the Jews will face this, is this idea of the king or the emperor being worshipped as a god. Now, from a pagan perspective, that ain't no big deal, because any service that they're doing to the pagan gods anyway is pretty much appeasement or half-hearted or anything like that, and they would project that onto the Jews or the early Christians, and that's not the case. Well, obviously it's not. But so for them, something like this is not a big deal, but these guys figured out Daniel would do it anyway, so to him it was a big deal, and they attacked his strength.
Yeah.
In that regard. But the early Christians are going to face exactly the same thing with the Roman emperors at various times in the first 300 years of the church. And to them, it's no big deal. We don't even care if you meet it. Just say that you'll, you know, worship our emperor and everything will be fine. And they will do it.
Right. And what's amazing about that is I still get amazed when God told Timothy that they were to pray for the king and all those in high places, that the church could have a peaceful and tranquil life. And I think we have the same God today, that no matter what we go through, God's going to protect who?
Us. That's part of the lesson.
Us. And some of us may have to pay a price for that, correct? Some may die for that, or lose things they have and stuff. So it's very, very interesting. Anybody else? Good thoughts. All right, let's continue to go on here if I can. So, verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the document. That is the injunction. King Darius didn't think about Daniel at this time, did he? King Darius is going to think about Daniel. Because again, as we see, Daniel seems to have if you allow me to use the word, friendly relationship with Nebuchadnezzar. Apparently Darius really likes who? We'll see. Daniel, okay? So let's go on and read here. And of course, God's involved in all this. All right. All right, verses, let's see, is there something I wanted to bring something else out there. This seemed like a reasonable request to Darius, and some has already brought out the idea of Rodney brought out the idea of the political stand at it and so forth. I think we've got that covered. All right, let's go to verses 10 to 15. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, that would have taken a few days, don't you think? I mean, Darius signs the document, and there's a whole kingdom that this document has to go out to, correct? I mean, it wasn't just a matter of picking up the telephone and saying, or sending on teletype, or like we would do today on the computer. It took some effort. So when Daniel heard that this had been signed, he entered his house in protest. It's like kind of how I see it. When he heard, he entered his house and he talked to the one whom he needed to talk with, correct? And so he entered his house. Now his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem. And he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. What do you think that some advice that Daniel might get today from some that are believers?
Shut the windows.
Shut the window. Hide in your closet, right? It seems like Daniel stands up here. The windows are open. People know that he does this 3 times a day. And he knew that when he went up and kneeled down, he was signing his what? His death sentence. And he knew what the death sentence was. Be thrown in lines. That would have been a hard way to go, wouldn't it? I mean, but he knew that that was it. But that did not alter his practice in worshiping his God. I don't even see any hesitancy there, do you? Not the idea I need to think about this or, I need to spend some. He just goes to his room, kneels down, opens the window, and he prays to his God. And he's very strong in these things. Now, what's the lesson for us today? I mean, that's what actually occurred. That's what God wants. Daniel did this. And in the culture that he lived in, he was signing his own death warrant, correct? He knew that. And so Daniel's at a place in his life where he is determined that he's going to serve God if it cost him everything. And he's pretty much ruling everything, isn't he, in a lot of ways? I mean, he's pretty dominant in getting the jobs done that the king has set him to, that does not violate or come in between him and his God. And so here we are, and so he's there. And he does this 3 times a day. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition. In other words, hiding outside the house. It's kind of like, okay, there he is. We've been waiting for this. Now we can all get together and we go to the king. And that's what he does. So Daniel was making petition and supplication before his God. Then they approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. And I like the way they set the king up on this. They said, did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days is be cast in the lion's den? Now, whose name didn't they mention at first? Daniel's. I think they knew that might have been risky ground. And they said, King, did you not do this? And the king would say, I didn't. And if a man or a woman or whatever doesn't bow down or pray to me through me, they're going to lose their lives in the lion's den. And the amazing thing about it is, did Darius have a choice from that point on about the lion's den? Could he forgive anybody? He couldn't, could he? And so he's kind of in between a rock and a hard place, and these people that are out after Daniel just kind of sets the scene for this particular event here. So the king replied, the statement is true according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be what? I think it's interesting the king says that. The king says, well, he's basically saying, you know the law, and you know that I can't revoke this. That this law has to be carried out. You know that. Now, I think that's kind of interesting. He's probably like, well, why are these people telling me about this? Well, they're doing what? They're setting him up. And they make him say, you know what the law says. That I can't revoke this. You suppose they're tingling just a little bit with joy? They think they've got Daniel where they want him, but they forget about Daniel's God. And they knew, and here's another thing that we've got to really understand. They knew Daniel's integrity. Did they not? Did they know what he thought about his God, Tarji?
Well, I was going to say, not only did they know about Daniel's integrity, but they also knew how the king felt about Daniel.
Yeah, I think you're right.
They knew that this was a hard thing for the king to do. So that's why they emphasized, saying, now this is a law you signed. You got to go through with it.
Yeah. Gene?
I just want to point, my translation is New King James, and in mine, verse.
He's been dead a long
it
time,
says
but-
for 30 days, but in 12 it says, have you not signed a decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, which is different.
Oh, boy.
So when we were talking about translations
Uh-huh.
on Thursday morning.
Oh, uh-huh.
I mean, that's not the same,
Yeah. Okay.
according to this translation.
So explain to me how that's not the same. I'm not being smart by that.
Well, for 30 days means 30 days.
Mm-hmm.
Within 30 days could just be 1 day.
And that's how I would have saw that, but I'll look at that differently now, okay? Thank you. Everybody get the point that Gene was making? Either way, there's no way out of this, is there? And you were thinking about,
I got him out.
you got, okay. Well, you got him out of it. So are you telling us if we're in trouble with anybody, we need to come to you and you can get us out of it?
No, it's what we were studying Thursday morning.
Oh.
Make sure your translation is.
Yeah, we're studying hermeneutics on Thursday morning in our Thursday morning get-together, so it's kind of interesting. Thank you. I want to say again, it's important for us to understand, I think, that they knew what kind of man Daniel was. They knew that he worshiped his God. They knew that he prayed to his God. And they knew that there was nothing that they could do to stop him. That's why they went with this law, because they knew Daniel would what? He'd violate it. They're just waiting around to see him violate it, right? They knew he would do it. That's what I think. You may think differently, but I think they knew him. They knew his character. They knew what he would do. So when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he continued kneeling and giving thanks to God 3 times a day. Then these men came in agreement to the king and talked to him about that and said, you put this in law? And he said, yes, you know that. Look at verse 13. Then they answered and spoke before the king. Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, laying that out, aren't they? Remember, he's a captive. And you've kind of elevated him up here, and we don't want him to go any higher. But you remember, he's an exile from Judah, pays no attention to you. Is that totally a true statement? Why isn't it a true statement?
Because he's still a loyal servant, doing what he's supposed to do.
But he's not going to let him stand in between him and his God, right? All right. So, and they're talking about, of course, this edict for 30 days. Or, how did you say that? Okay. No, I think it's interesting. O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. My question is, do you think Darius hadn't even thought about Daniel, I think, through this whole thing? Do you think Darius probably knew that Daniel did that 3 times a day? Maybe, possibly. But the whole point is, I don't think Darius signed this just to get Daniel. I think he signed it like some say it was, he may have been thinking that this is a way to establish his authority, and this is a way to pull his kingdom together. That's up to personal opinion, all right? So whatever it was, they've kind of laid it out to him. Okay, listen, your buddy, Daniel, violated your order. Now, what they knew is that no matter who it was, but especially when they said it was Daniel, they knew the king couldn't what? Couldn't back out. Matter of fact, they laid the groundwork. Have you ever seen that? Laying the groundwork and said, now you remember this thing. And he says, that's right. I signed it. It can't be changed. Look at verse 14. Then as soon as the king heard the statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel. Now, would he have been deeply distressed if it was Andy?
Probably not.
Probably not. Sorry.
Hey, I can talk to that one too.
You know, your lovely wife had talked to Darius. So, anyhow, and even until sunset, he kept exerting himself to what?
Find some way out.
Yeah, to rescue. What did he already know?
He
Couldn't do it. Even if he did like they did in Esther, even if he wrote an ordinance to spread this throughout the kingdom that the Jews could protect themselves, how was Daniel to protect himself from the lion's den? There's no, you know. So he's going in the lion's den no matter what, but Darius is not happy about it. Yes.
Well, I've always thought that back when they said all the administrators came to him, who was not there at the time? One of his top 3 administrators. He never gave it any thought. But I'll bet he looked back on that and thought, you know, they were tricking me way back then, and Daniel wasn't there.
Yeah.
To see part of the group that supposedly said, yes, let's do that.
Those fellows found out how he felt at the end of the chapter, right? So, all right. So it's kind of interesting. So he was deeply stressed. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, you know, quit putting this off. He's put it off all what? All day. Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Do you think the king might have wanted to bring the sword down right about then on those guys? Now remember, king, and the king's concerned about Daniel, how he can get Daniel out of this. The king knows he can't get him out of it. And then these little, I wasn't going to say that, came to him and said, now remember, then the king gave order. He had no choice. I love this verse. Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den, and the king spoke and said to Daniel, this is powerful. Your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Now, I know God's involved in this, but he knew that Daniel constantly served who? So it was apparent. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't put off in the shadows someplace. These people knew that he served his God. Good lesson for us, right? We shouldn't put off in the shadow or hide the fact that we serve the only God, and that we'll not allow anything to come between us and that God. And so he does that, and I think it's just a beautiful, beautiful thought. And then the stone is rolled over, and you know the king takes his signet ring and put that clay over that, whatever it is, and he put his mark on that. That was the closure of the thing. In other words, this says that the king has done what he said he would do. And of course, that was also to see that no one broke into it. Then in verse 18, the king went off to his palace, spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him. And Andy, if he'd have thrown you in the lion's den, he wouldn't have done this. Right? I mean, you understand what I'm saying. He didn't, but he did care about who? Isn't that amazing? This king knew that Daniel served his God. And no matter what, that he was going to what? This is a pagan king, but he still liked who? I think he liked Daniel. I think Daniel served him well as a captive. That's what I think. And so he had no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled him. Then the king arose at dawn, at the break of dawn, and went in haste to the lion's den. What do you think he was thinking on the way to the den? Is he going to be alive? All right. When he had come near the den, he cried out, "O Daniel!" The king spoke and the king spoke and said to Daniel, "Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve." And I like the idea again. He said, "Constantly serve." One part-time. As he stood before the king, he served his God. "Has this God who you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions?" And Daniel spoke to the king. He said, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths. Couldn't touch me. O king, I have committed no crime." Serving God above man's law is not a crime. As far as the Medes and the Persians are concerned, Daniel committed a what? He violated the law. But he said, "King, I've not committed any crime because we need to serve this God above all else." So here's his den of lions, and they're hungry. And before he even hits the ground, you know, God has sealed their mouth. And Daniel spoke, "King will live forever." He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't rebuke the king in any way. Well, he kind of did, but you know what I mean, in an intentional way. My God sent his angel. I've committed no crime. Then the king was very pleased and gave orders to Daniel to be taken out of the lion's den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him, because he had trusted his God. Now, do you suppose that Daniel slept that night? I kind of think he did. Can you imagine hitting the floor of the lion's den and their mouths are sealed shut? They're just kind of laying over in a corner because God sent what? An angel down to protect. Kind of reminds you of Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14. Angels are ministering spirits. The Psalms talk about angels that minister to us. Angel ministered to Daniel that night and went forth. So let's continue. We'll finish the chapter and we'll be done just about on right. Then the king gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel. Can you imagine? They're being called. They may not even know Daniel's alive, and they're probably thinking, "The king is going to thank us." Maybe, I don't know. And they cast them and their children and their wives in the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. So lions are pretty powerful, and there's more than just a couple of lions in this den, apparently. And they threw all these people and all their family, everything in there, and they're dead. Lesson to fathers. Your children can pay the price as a result of your what? Your sins. That's what happened here, right? The children were innocent. The wives were still pagans, but they were innocent of this crime. So they paid the price. And I don't imagine they even had time to think about it, these guys, while they were being thrown in the pit. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in the land, "May your peace abound. I make a decree." And once a decree is made, once something, it can't be changed, right? And you may say, well, this is a decree, but I make a decree, in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Now, he doesn't exclude he doesn't say stop worshiping other gods. He said, when you hear Daniel's God mentioned, you need to fear and tremble. Why? For he is the living God and enduring forever, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. Now, I think Daniel's there helping him write things, and God is really involved in this, all right? But this is the king's words. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And so he tells his people right off the bat, I threw Daniel in the lion's den and he lived. They tell me that, I don't know, I've heard the stories, that men have actually lived through the electric chair. You know, that's why they zap them, I guess, 3 times, you know what I mean? You know, if a guy wants to live through that, just let him go, right? But here you go. Daniel violated the law of the Medes and the Persians. He was punished. Well, he was expected to be punished, and he wasn't punished. He came up out of the lion's den. That's power. Because the lions were hungry. And Darius said, boy, you know, you need to fall down before the living God of Daniel. Because his kingdom is one that will not be what? Destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. Is that verse important? Yes, we live in a kingdom that cannot be what? Destroyed, and it will last for how long? Forever. I'm trying to think about forever. Do you ever think about that? Forever? How long is forever? It's forever, right? I mean, we're used to time. Anyhow, so it ends in this chapter, you know, with Daniel's deliverance, of course, and the idea of don't mess with the king because it doesn't pay. And it says in verse 28, so this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In other words, during the reign of the Medes and the Persians, Daniel was what? Why was Daniel successful? Huh? Because of his faith, because of his endurance, and all men knew that he served who? The God. Anyone want to add anything to all this? You're thinking? All right, next week we're going to go into Daniel chapter 7. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the kings of Rome. I'll give you some dates and so forth, some things. And we're going to get into a part of the book of Daniel that it can be very difficult sometimes for some to understand and to look at. Very important for us to understand because it gives us reassurance that we are who we claim to be. So let's bow for prayer, please. Father, grateful we could study your word, thankful that you love us, thankful, Father, that we serve you, and we know that, Father, you are with us no matter what. Help us to walk the walk you want us to walk, and help us, Father, to stand firm in your word. In Christ's name, amen. Have a good break.